There's usually one camp that says only calories matter, and then there's this other camp that says calories don't matter at all, and it's all hormone balance and insulin. And I think the biggest myth is believing either of those extremes and not realizing that...
I think we're good. We're rolling. Kara Collier, what's up?
What's up? Excited to be here.
Thanks for being on the show. Dr. Kara Collier.
Dietitian.
But you
can call me doctor.
I'll call you doctor.
Yeah.
I'll call you whatever you want. But yeah, that's dope that you... I don't think we've ever had a real life dietitian on the show before.
Really?
I don't think so.
I love that.
Yeah, we've had a lot of like PhDs, medical doctors, things like that. But yeah, love an RD.
I like to say that I am not like most RDs.
What is that? What do you mean by that?
I think in the space that we are in, RDs get a little bit of a bad rep, and it's probably justified.
Oh man!
So you not gotta to completely just
you gotta
there's
unpack
more to unpack.
Yeah.
The reason being that our traditional training isn't that great. You know, so we're taught kind of the basic, just simplistic knowledge. Calories in, calories out is the only thing that matters. Carb-controlled diets for diabetics, et cetera. A lot of archaic information is taught. And then you just kind of like do that. And unfortunately, I think there's a stereotype of a lot of people who get into the field just like nutrition. They don't do a deep dive, and then they just kind of like regurgitate those things that they were taught. However, I think there is a subset of dietitians and nutrition professionals that are like some of the most intelligent and interesting people I've ever met. So there's the subset where we learn the physiology, so the biochemistry and all the pathways involved. And if you take that information and then you use that as the base knowledge that you have, and then you think critically about all the new information coming in, you do your own clinical evidence and you change with the information you're learning and seeing, then you're powerful. You're geared with the best of both worlds, understanding the science and then really being like curious and knowledgeable. But not everybody has that second part. So sometimes dietitians get a little bit of a bad rep in this space, but I like to believe that I'm a little bit more of a critical thinker than some of us might be dubbed as.
I love it. I've definitely interacted with a fair share of dietitians on social media, and I will tell you that there are some amazing dietitians, and then there are some that seem toxic, that just seem like really like perpetuating the notion that like, well, they kind of, I mean, they're a little bit all over the place. Like some are like, have kind of fallen into the health at any size movement and are just function as complete reactives to the toxicity of diet culture and have created this equally toxic anti-diet culture movement, which I think has many problems that we could talk about. Then there are a lot that kind of like make it all about calories, and which obviously are important, but if you're making it all about calories, I think that can be problematic.
Yeah, just like I think it's natural human tendency to want to think in black and white, think in extremes. And, nutrition professionals are also part of that, as with every professional. So you find that thing, that lens in which you see the world, and then you hold on to it too much.
Yeah.
Not being open-minded enough. And I'll say that a lot of dietitians get interested in the space because of a history of their own eating disorders. And this is something I've seen over and over. I bet it's more than 50% of dietitians have a history of disordered eating themselves, have worked through that and found healing within food and nutrition. But then you see the world through that lens, and which is why I think there's such a strong movement for health at every size, for, really mindful eating and intuitive eating, which all have a time and a place to some extent, but it's not the only lens to see the world through. And I think that's kind of the fallacy in thinking that people have, is kind of that like black and white, or like, this is the one thing that worked for me, so I'm going to apply it to everyone. And you see that all over the place in nutrition.
It's so true. Yeah, I do remember seeing research that alluded to this what you just mentioned, that that there is like this real prevalence of eating disorders within the RD community.
Yeah, hopefully not active, more of a history of eating disorders. If, you've really worked through it yourself, you might always have a propensity for disordered eating if you have that history. But yeah, a lot of
But it's like that's the lens.
yeah, a
that
lot of
you're-
dietitians are drawn to the field through that personal history.
Wow.
And I think it's great that we're bringing more awareness to the disordered eating element that happens within nutrition, because it is a real thing. But again, I think that we can take it too far with the extremes of, I'm personally not an advocate on the side of the health at every size. I think our weight matters a lot, and I think we're doing more harm than good when we're pushing that thought process and that agenda. With that being said, sometimes that's why you have to get to know a person one-on-one at the end of the day. If you really want to make a difference, you really have to tailor it to the individual, because somebody might not have a propensity for disordered eating, and you really don't need to think through that lens. And instead, they like discipline and structure, and you're going to give them, a calorie allotment and a plan, and that might work for them. Where for someone else, they need some moderation. They need a little bit of their favorite foods in order for it to be sustainable. They need to think about food differently. So it really depends person to person. Good dietitian will take that into account.
Yeah, it's so true. I think with the health at any size movement, it's interesting because obviously we live in this like hyper-polarized, inflamed world now where, the more divergent and extreme a viewpoint, the more traction it seems to get on social media. And so you'll see pictures sometimes of like really overweight people exercising, and people will, argue that it's like that's not healthy, but exercise, no matter what size you're at, is healthy, right?
Yeah,
so to see an overweight or obese person exercising, that actually is healthy, right?
Exactly, yeah.
But it's like if you show somebody who is not exercising and you just kind of like, and we're talking purely about like anthropometric, like this person is obese. No, it's better to be, you can be more or less healthy at a given size, but for all intents and purposes, all else, being equal, being not obese is healthier than being obese.
Yes, the evidence is too strong that excess weight, especially, visceral fat, that fat around your organs, but excess weight in general is increased risk of just about every chronic health condition that you can think of. That evidence is really strong. That doesn't mean that there's going to be people who are considered overweight and are not showing any signs of any sort of metabolic dysfunction or disease risk factors. I think those small minority of people do exist, but being obese and having excess fat on your body increases your risk. And that is just a fact. So I think that we've taken it too far in thinking that it's okay to be overweight or obese. It's more about how we approach helping people lose weight that I think is important.
What would you say are some of the biggest like myths that you encounter with regard to losing the weight and keeping it off?
There's a lot. Well, talking about extremes in this space, there's usually one camp that says only calories matter. And then there's this other camp that says calories don't matter at all, and it's all hormone balance and insulin. And I think the biggest myth is believing either of those extremes and not realizing that it's multifactorial. Both of those things matter. So again, having it a little bit more complex thinking and understanding all of the different factors that are involved. And so I think people tend to overly rely on one extreme or the other and see that initial success with either method. So either, really minimizing insulin by doing like a ketogenic diet and starting to see weight loss success, or monitoring your calories, cutting calories and seeing weight loss success, and then tend to have a stall because they're so focused on just one modality or one, hyper-focused lane, when it's really all these other factors to consider. And so I think one of the biggest, myths is just believing in those extremes and not having more nuanced approach. But with that being said, another myth is that, people who truly do have insulin resistance, metabolic dysfunction, so type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, it is harder to just focus on counting calories in the beginning with these individuals. So when we're in that extreme camp where it's like, just reduce your caloric intake, if we truly have a disrupted metabolism, which is our energy system, then that means we're not processing energy as well. So if we're just focused on reducing energy intake, it's actually much more challenging for those individuals to start to see that initial success in my clinical, practice so far. So usually if we focus on something else as a low-hanging fruit and start to see that flywheel effect of weight loss, then we can get them in a better shape to have more healthy energy regulation, energy metabolism, and then you can start to kind of incorporate some of those other factors. So it's just like taking all those different factors and nuances into account.
So somebody who is struggling with weight loss, who's overweight, maybe even obese, what is the typical advice that those patients are given?
Exercise more, eat less, which, those things are part of the equation. And again, it's not, I don't believe in the camp that those things don't matter at all. Like I do, calories matter, and calories for weight loss are going to be one of the most important factors to consider.
Right.
But what people aren't considering is that, again, if we think about insulin resistance in these individuals, most likely, if you're really obese, you probably have some form of insulin resistance, even if it's not all the way to the stage of diabetes. So if insulin resistance is occurring, what that essentially means is that the normal functions of insulin are not happening in the way that they should. And those normal functions of insulin are being in, pro-anabolic, anti-catabolic activities. So anabolic means building. Building our energy stores, our glycogen, which is our glucose storage base, building muscle, building DNA, building fat tissue, and then halting the ability to break down fat, break down glucose stores, et cetera. So when we're in this state where insulin's functions are compromised and they're not properly, functioning as they should, then we have a lot of difficulty regulating that energy system in the same way. And so that traditional advice of eat less, move more is going to potentially not work and just be frustrating. So I think the other myth with weight loss is that people don't consider the emotional element when you're just giving advice. If you've struggled with weight all your life, you probably have a very emotional tie to that number on the scale. And you probably have an emotional relationship to, food in a way that, and I think that's why we consider disordered eating and intuitive eating, because if you have that emotional response, it's much harder to look at things a little bit more objectively and to be more disciplined and regimented when you have that kind of emotional tie. Because you might step on the scale, feel like you're doing everything right, and your weight goes up 2 pounds, and it could be due from a variety of things. We all know that could be from just some inflammation. It could be, fluid balance. It could be a lot of different things. And then that tends to, in my experience, lead to frustration, disappointment, and then kind of falling off the wagon and binging or, losing sight of the consistent habits that you have. And so sometimes when we can remove some of that emotional experience, we can get people in a better place to be more consistent with those habits. Because at the end of the day, the real way to lose weight is to be consistent.
Absolutely.
That's the unsexy advice that doesn't make the headlines or doesn't get retweeted over and over.
Yeah.
But it's really just consistency. So then it's, how do we build consistency? We make something that's attainable, but we also kind of remove that all or nothing mindset. People tend to want to be all in or all out. It's that black and white thinking again. It's either I've been really good or I've been really bad. And if we can remove that black or white thinking, then it's not, I was bad yesterday, so screw it. I'm going to do whatever for the next 5 days.
Right.
It's, I had a meal yesterday that wasn't necessarily aligned with what is healthy and fueling me properly, but that's okay. Each day is a new day. So trying to get people to remove some of that extreme thinking can help build consistency.
No, I love this because I actually very recently, I didn't start out as an obese person. I've always had a pretty healthy relationship with food, but I recently lost 15 pounds of fat that I intentionally set out to lose because I wanted to drop my body fat percentage points by a few and get to those single digit numbers. And I learned a ton in the process. It was so interesting. That's part of the reason actually why I did it, because I wanted to, there's one thing to have the data in the back of your head and the methodology, but I wanted the real world experience. And what is interesting is it's exactly what you said. The scale, it's not linear. The scale would go up and down and up and down, but it would trend down. you know, but like if you have an intense workout one day, you know, that inflammation is going to cause your body to like hold on to more water. If you eat more carbs, you know, on a given day, you're going to be holding on to more water. And by the way, carbs don't necessarily make you fat. It's just like, in fact, one of the things that I found to be most helpful during my fat loss phase was my carbohydrate intake, because that allows me to sustain my energy in the gym, which allows you ultimately to hold on to your muscle. Yeah, absolutely agree. And it's so much different when you've gone through it yourself. Yeah. I always give the example personally, which people think is silly because it was only like 10 pounds that I wanted to lose for the longest time. But when you feel optimal at a certain weight, you know, 10 pounds can feel like a lot. You know, I'm not saying it was ever overweight or obese, but it was these like 10 pounds that I felt like I was doing all the right things. I'm like, I know all of the information, and it would just kind of like fluctuate up and down, and I was super frustrated. So then when I took it a little bit more seriously and kind of had that plan, and actually wearing the continuous glucose monitors for the first time helped me do that, because it did remove some of that emotional aspect of that frustration when you're like, I was really good all week and I'm still at the same weight I was last week. Like, why is this not working? So removing some of that emotional element by looking at kind of data instead of that subjective experience can be really helpful. And that's similarly with, you know, we always tell people, well, we have like a weight tracking in our app, but track it somehow, you know, put it on a Google spreadsheet and convert it into a graph so that you can see that trend line rather than getting fixated on a specific number in isolation. It's really always like those trends that can become more meaningful to people of if we're in the right direction or not. Yeah. And also the leaner you get, the more difficult and slower it becomes to lose that additional weight. Like, it was actually a breeze for me to go from 15% body fat to 11% body fat. It was super easy. It just like melted off. I just started eating home more often, and I cut some of the added fats and oils that I was like, you know, that I would typically put onto my food. And I wasn't eating out in restaurants, which all restaurant food is just coated in mystery fat calories. You know, it's that's like one of my like top tips when people want to get healthier in any regard, not even necessarily about weight loss. It's just like cook at home as much as possible. Like that's one of the number one things you can do. 1,000%. Yeah. But then like I got to 10% body fat, still pretty easy. And then I was like, well, if I got to 10% body fat, and this is pretty easy. Like I'm not miserable. Like I'm really enjoying the process, and I feel great. Let's see if I can get to like 9%. Now I wasn't DEXA scanning, so just to put that out there for people that are like, you know, professional, you know, fitness or body composition competitors. I was using the in-body like electrical impedance thing, which is not gold standard, but according to that, I got to like 9% body fat. And that required a little bit more like diligence, you know, and like and cutting here and there. And this wasn't like a health decision. Like, you do not have to be like, being shredded and being healthy are not synonymous, right? Like at 15%, I was already at a very healthy body fat. But just from the learning experience alone, I feel like, you know, since I got to the, you know, to that place, you know, it's given me like really great perspective to be able to like talk about. Yeah, absolutely. Just the personal experience. And that's why I try all kinds of diets as well. Yeah. It's still, you know, just your N of one. Like my experience isn't necessarily going to be the same as everyone else's experience, but it's good to try those different things, see how it feels, see how my labs change, you know, see how my weight changes, see how my energy levels change. So I'm always experimenting. I think everyone in the field should be. Yeah, absolutely. So what's the relationship then that blood sugar has with this? Because you've mentioned CGMs, and I've been looking into NutriSense. The technology that you guys have is super impressive. But yeah, so how can monitoring your blood sugar with a continuous glucose monitor, like the NutriSense device, like how can that help you in your, not just like your weight loss journey, but your, you know, the journey for achieving a longer health span and lifespan? Yeah, absolutely. And while it can help with weight loss, and a lot of our members do lose weight, you know, more than 90% of our members who come in with a weight loss goal will lose weight at a healthy trajectory. We always remove the focus of that. Even if people come in and they're like, I want to lose weight, we're like, that's great, but let's refocus on some of these other benefits first. So even though weight loss really can come with a device, it's not where we think it's most important to focus. But monitoring glucose levels and having good, stable glucose levels benefits us in many ways. We can think about it first as in just like our day-to-day function. Having stable glucose levels means having stable energy levels.
again, metabolism and our glucose is really thinking about our energy system. That's what metabolism and metabolic health is. It's just our ability to regulate and process energy efficiently. And so good, healthy metabolic health means working like a well-oiled machine. All of our different organ systems are talking and communicating efficiently. We're switching between fuels effectively, so metabolic flexibility, and things are working really well. And so when our glucose levels are stable, we can feel that in our day-to-day energy levels. We feel focused, we're able to concentrate, we have stable energy, none of that crashing, hanger. It actually reduces cravings as well, which can help lead to that weight loss. So that day-to-day function, people just feel better when their glucose levels are stable. And part of that day-to-day tracking is enhancing that mind-body connection as well. We have so many people who, the first time you use a CGM and you're seeing this data, so it's showing you, 24/7 what your glucose levels are doing, a movie picture of your glucose, you start to make those connections that are really meaningful. So you start to see that, oh, when my glucose spikes and then crashes, that's when I get hangry and tired and I can't focus and I have brain fog. And so then eventually you don't need the CGM on to know what that feels like and to know what you might have done incorrectly or what you need to change to avoid that feeling. And that might seem obvious. People are like, of course, that when you eat something sugary and your glucose crashes, you're going to feel a crash, but it's not obvious to most people. A lot of times it just feels like, normal is normal and I don't really know why I need to take a nap after I eat lunch. It's just the way that it is. So being able to connect what's happening inside with how you feel is really, really powerful for people. So that's kind of like the day-to-day function. But then if we take a broader view, by keeping our glucose levels stable and by having good metabolic health, it's really the foundation of disease prevention and health optimization. So some of the most common chronic health conditions are tied to insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. The most obvious example being type 2 diabetes, which is really, the example of we've gone all the way to the other end of metabolic dysfunction. So I always describe metabolic health as kind of like a spectrum. It's not black and white. Again, it's not like I'm metabolically healthy or I'm metabolically unhealthy. There's this long spectrum where you can start to see signs of metabolic dysfunction. And then kind of the end of the spectrum there is type 2 diabetes, when we're no longer able to partition our fuel correctly, when those systems no longer are working well enough where we've reached these really high glucose thresholds. And that's what we want to try to avoid getting to. So by monitoring glucose, you can also detect things way, way earlier than with some of the more common metrics. Your annual labs, your point of care glucose aren't going to capture some of those early warning signs that will help prevent or manage some of these conditions. So again, it's not just diabetes. There's also a lot of neurodegenerative diseases that are tied to metabolic dysfunction, cardiovascular disease, hypertension. Many cancers are tied now to, or understanding more, are connected to metabolic health. So the big picture that I really care about is that disease prevention, that health optimization. So as a dietitian, I initially worked in the ICUs with critically care patients, critically ill patients. And what I saw every day was not, people coming into the ICU with gunshot wounds or, car accident trauma. It was typically people coming in with acute complications from chronic illnesses. So needing a leg amputation because of uncontrolled diabetes that, was just mismanaged or never managed, needing to be put on dialysis, kidney dialysis because of uncontrolled hypertension. That's what I saw every single day. And that's what led me to want to start this company, because I was really trying to figure out how we can build that awareness sooner, because 80 to 90% of these events can be preventable. It's estimated that 90% of type 2 diabetes cases could be prevented. I would like to believe it's closer to 100, but
yeah.
So a lot of these things don't need to happen. We just need the right tools and information and behavior change, consistency to really change the way that things are happening.
Absolutely. One concern that I have, though, is that by hyperfixating on our blood sugar curves, by necessity, wouldn't that exclude foods that are otherwise quite healthy, but that might lead to a quote unquote blood sugar spike? I mean, like if I eat a banana on an empty stomach, right? Before my workout, which is like the perfect time in my view to like eat a high glycemic food, the blood glucose monitor is gonna flag that as being something that's like not optimal, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so one of the myths of glucose monitoring is that we have to have a flat line. Our glucose needs to be flat. So that's one of the first things. We have educational material in our app, and we also pair all of our customers with a dietitian. So a dietitian that I have trained and picked myself. So, part of the cool dietitian group, but
love it.
So part of that is that you have a human there that helps you kind of understand the nuances that are going on here and help you understand the bigger picture view. So the dietitian will learn what your goals are, what your health background is, and they're going to kind of message you back and forth. You get unlimited messaging with them in order to kind of help pick up some of these nuances and make sure that you're not walking away with the wrong information. But the other thing is that, a glucose spike isn't inherently a bad thing, or a fluctuation in your glucose levels aren't necessarily negative. And that's one of the biggest myths I'm trying to educate people on, because there is a lot of, people on Instagram or podcasts that are going for this flatline glucose value, and that's not the goal. There is a point of diminishing returns at some point, Lower is not always better. I always explain it as if we had a continuous lipid monitor and you saw your lipids fluctuating, then suddenly there's nothing left to eat if you want to keep everything flat. Like we need to eat food.
Exact. That's an argument that I've made. It's like, we're measuring glucose, right? And so like obviously a blood glucose monitor is going to show a spike from something that we eat that has digestible carbohydrate in it. But if you were to wear like a continuous triglyceride monitor, we know that high triglycerides is a risk factor for heart disease, like a strong one, right?
Exactly.
But it's like the fasting triglycerides that we're most worried about. If you have like a fatty meal, right, that's like actually your blood takes on the appearance of pink cream after a very fatty meal.
Yeah, you're going to see, if anyone's ever accidentally forgotten to fast before they get their labs, this happens all the time. People never get reminded to fast beforehand. And I always would get clients who would come and they'd be like, my triglycerides are 500. And first question is, were you eating it all before? And they're like, yeah, I had a fried chicken sandwich. And it's like, well, I would go get your labs retested. But,
yeah, seriously.
That's exactly the point. We're not expecting no fluctuation in glucose. We're not expecting no fluctuation in our lipids. It's really about what is normal versus abnormal. And that's why, we use things like a daily score and a meal score to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of if this is optimal or if this is out of the normal ranges. So you could eat that banana and your glucose could jump 30 points and be up to, like 120 or 130, and you're going to get a 10 glucose score for that meal because that's perfectly okay. And maybe if your dietitian saw that you paired that banana with a bunch of other unhealthy foods, so maybe like you for some reason chug some canola oil with it, they're going to tell you that might not be the best thing to support your health goals of, weight loss and disease prevention, etc. So our goal eventually is to take into account other data points because glucose is not the end all be all. But part of the reason we started with glucose is because I think about it through the lens of the 80-20 rule. What changes are going to make the biggest bang for your buck? And glucose does tell us a lot about our health. And not only does glucose fluctuate in response to our dietary habits, but it also fluctuates in response to our physical activity habits and or lack of physical activity habits. So the more sedentary we are, the higher glucose values are going to be. It also responds to stress. So both acute stressors and chronic stress, psychological stress and physical stressors. So things like illness or injury, in addition to things like anxiety and worrying, and then also things like sleep. So some of those core foundational elements of good health that we want to promote, we're going to see reflected in our glucose values. And that helps people understand some of those core elements that they need to be considering if they're trying to live more of a holistically healthy life. So we've found that glucose is a great place for many people to start. And majority of people, if you just take kind of like an average sampling, have dysregulated glucose values. It's estimated that over 90% of the population has some form of metabolic dysfunction. So while maybe you and I might have a normal healthy response to a banana before our workout, normal healthy responses to foods throughout the day because we're metabolically healthy, that's a lot different than the average person out there. And, you know, while we believe that you can gain a lot of benefit from using this technology and wearing this device if you're super healthy, because you still have personalized responses to food that are unique, or maybe you don't have your stress as under control as you think, or maybe you're not actually sleeping as optimally as you think. The real longer term benefits we see are for those 90% of the population that does have some metabolic dysfunction, signs of insulin resistance, where this is going to be a good awareness and behavior change tool for them.
I love it. It's like a check engine light.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, having lost 10 or 15 pounds of body fat, the second law of thermodynamics would dictate that, yes, I was in a calorie deficit to do that. And I really have been making use of carbohydrates, even foods that I haven't really eaten in many, many years, I've welcomed back because of their utility for me to sustain that energy so that I can continue to lift intensely in the gym, which is like mission critical to maintaining lean body mass. So I've been starting my mornings with pre-workout. I've been eating like organic, gluten-free, glyphosate-free oats with like a banana. You know, these are foods that like I typically for years I didn't eat because first of all, I don't think that oats they're not a nutrient dense food, but they're carbohydrate dense. And those carbohydrates
they're satiating though.
They're satiating, good source of beta glucans, soluble fiber. But mainly it's like carbohydrates as a tool, as a performance enhancing tool that you can use in the fight for better body composition.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the questions that I commonly get asked is if carbs are bad or if we should all be low carb or keto. And I do not believe, carbs are bad. And that's part of the belief that we went over, that I don't think we're aiming for a flat glucose line. Carbohydrates are going to raise your glucose, but really what I believe is that it's important to match your carbohydrate tolerance to your consumption.
Yeah.
And so that is a lot different than the conventional wisdom of, if we look at the My Plate or My Pyramid or whatever the latest dietary recommendations are, it's like 45 to 65% of your calories from carbohydrates is the general recommendation for the average American. And that I also believe would work for very, very few people. Definitely not the average American is going to thrive with 65% of their calories from carbohydrates.
And your average American is like sedentary. The CDC, I think, just released that like 1 in 4 adults is completely sedentary.
Yeah. I read a statistic recently that said 77% of Americans don't have any form of exercise in their routine.
Damn.
So that, exercise is more than potentially just being totally sedentary, no structured exercise.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people aren't really exercising to any extent. And so again, that 45 to 65% of calories from carbohydrates might work for like an athlete.
Yeah.
And that could be completely okay. Like we've seen people consume that many carbohydrates and maintain good glucose values overall, but they're usually men and they're usually athletes. So there tends to be a little bit of a gender difference as well with your carbohydrate threshold. So it's thinking about all those different factors of activity level, what state is your metabolic health in, because that's also going to matter. I don't believe carbs cause insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction. But if you think about our metabolism as like a highway system, where, carbs or cars are the glucose molecules, the fat molecules, and it's this busy system, and they need to go off of different exits to get where they need to be in these little side roads. Maybe they're going off to your brain, maybe they're going off to your muscles, but it's this busy highway system. And when our metabolism is working well, then there's no construction, there's no potholes, all the signs are clearly marked, and everything is going as it's supposed to. But when we have metabolic dysfunction, there's the signals are out, the exits are blocked, and things get blocked up. We have traffic jams. And so when we have metabolic dysfunction, removing some of those those carbohydrates, is going to help things move a little smoother and have less jams. So if we have metabolic dysfunction, we really need to remove carbohydrates. Maybe not completely, but probably reduce them. But that doesn't mean that that's the root cause. The root cause is the pothole we haven't fixed, or the sidewalk, or the side street that's blocked off. So removing the carbohydrates will help your body have less fuel to deal with, help it heal. But then we need to fix some of those underlying issues, which is usually be less sedentary, improve our insulin sensitivity, build lean body mass, lose some weight, reduce inflammation. So we have to remove some of these, fuel to the fire in order to solve some of the root cause. So again, some people might be able to have a lot of carbs. If you have some insulin resistance, probably less carbs. If you're sedentary, probably less carbs. And this will fluctuate day to day. The example you gave of this morning, or, if you work out and then you have the banana and maybe you have some oatmeal, if you skipped your workout, you're most likely not going to have the same exact meal. So helping people think through just their day-to-day nuance as well, so that they have a framework for how to think about food rather than trying to just follow a plan.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to know, make me a meal plan and I'll follow it. And I'm always what I always tell people is write down exactly what you've eaten every single moment for 3 weeks, and then I'll write you a meal plan.
Yeah.
And nobody can ever do it. But you can't actually follow a meal plan. Instead, you need to have a framework for yourself that works, of what foods are nourishing to you, what kind of guidelines are you working with, and then how do you adjust based off of your circumstance. So if I'm traveling and I didn't make it to the gym, I'm going to eat a lot more low carb diet today than if I hit my normal workouts on a regular day. So being able to kind of fluctuate day to day is also important.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not eating all those carbs and then sitting on my butt
exactly
in front of the TV. I'm eating them purposefully so that I can go to the gym and crush it in the gym and benefit from that, those peri-workout carbs, the glycogen that I'm storing and using. But also, wouldn't you say that because that highway analogy, it was so good, it was so elegant. To me what that is that paints the portrait of energy toxicity. Wouldn't you say though that for many people on the standard American diet that we're also consuming too many fat calories as well? Because I will tell you that the one variable that made the biggest difference for me was reducing fat calories. And I'm not saying that I went on a low-fat diet. Mm-hmm. Low-fat diets are not great because they put you at higher risk for gallstones. You need fat for digestion, for absorption of fat-soluble nutrients, and all that stuff. But the standard American diet is characterized, by crazy high carbohydrates, but also by tons of added fats too, right?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. A common story that we see a lot with our customers is that they'll reduce or decrease their type 2 diabetes, reverse it potentially by doing something like a ketogenic diet. They lose weight, but then they want to lose another 20 pounds. They're in a much healthier place. But they're still following that very, very high fat diet.
Yeah.
And usually all we got to do is remove the butter from their coffee and remove some of the heavy cream they're pouring on things.
Yeah.
And that's all it takes. So I 100% agree is those calories add up. And that's where when we pretend that calories don't matter,
right,
it's not helpful for people. That's not helping people if we completely ignore that. They did a lot of improvement with their health by following a ketogenic diet, but maybe it has a time and a place. And now that we've gotten you into a better place, you don't need all of those excess fat calories. And so really being a little bit more mindful of how those add up. And if nobody's ever tracked their calories, I do recommend doing so at the right time in the right place. Just like tracking anything, I think it's a helpful awareness tool. Same with continuous glucose monitoring. It's an awareness tool, but it doesn't mean you need to do it forever.
Absolutely.
So it's building that awareness, holding yourself on, accountable, holding yourself on track, and then you can kind of be in that routine when you feel like you're in a good place. So a lot of times if we ask people to start counting calories and tracking calories, those are the easy things that aren't driving satiety, because that's part of the equation too. Like we said, there's many factors to consider, but one of the most important ones is how satiating is each bite of food you put in your mouth, because that's going to help you not overeat. A lot of this is an equation to help reduce overeating, but that doesn't mean that a calorie is a calorie, and that, if you eat 400 calories of chicken versus 400 calories of peach rings, we're going to have a totally different satiety experience.
But how happy would you be?
You might be happy for a little bit until you hit the crash, and then you might be a little anxious.
Peach rings are, oh man, who doesn't love peach rings? No, it's so true. Even Sean Baker, carnivore extraordinaire Sean Baker, who I think is a hilarious follow on social media. I think he started like a cutting phase or something like that. And he's like zero carbs. Like he's only steak. He doesn't eat organ meats. He's just like ribeyes and like fatty cuts of meat and whatever. And he was like, and I saw somebody asked him on Twitter, well, how are you gonna lose the fat? And he's like, well, I'm gonna eat less fat. Yeah. You know, even for him, for somebody like that, I thought that was a cool moment, because it's like, you know, people tend to be so mired in their diet camps, you know, and he's obviously going to be painted as like a high fat carnivore dieter, but it's like, again, it just comes down to, you've got to find what's going to work for you and be the most satiating and the most sustainable and feel the least restrictive to you, right?
Yeah, and there's so much variability between people, and then also within yourself. Like you're saying, your circumstance is going to really drive what's most appropriate for you at that time. And, you know, thinking about women too, our hormonal changes are another huge factor to consider, especially menopause. You know, that's going to completely change what might be working well for you versus what worked for you in the past. But a lot of the reason I think that there's so much war with the nutrition world and so much debate is that because there's so much differences between people of what works and what doesn't work, you take your end of one experience, you become, you know, obsessed with that idea, and you assume that that is going to work the same for someone else. Can't tell you how many people we have worked with that say, you know, well, my cousin went carnivore and it's completely changed their life, and I've been trying it and I'm miserable, but I can't figure out like what I'm doing wrong. Help me adjust my carnivore diet. And it's like, well, it just might not be what's the best for you. Or same with low carb or low fat or, you know, XYZ diet. There's so much variability, and we probably only have scratched the surface of understanding why there's so much variability, but it's clear that there is. Same with, you know, there's always the debate on total fat intake and especially saturated fat intake. And in my clinical experience, what I've seen is there's certainly a proportion of the population where higher saturated fat diet does not seem to serve them well. It just doesn't. You can see it in their labs, and not just LDL-C, but some of the more labs that we now understand have a better picture of what's going on. So more, you know, LDL-P, ApoB, if we're looking at CRP. So all these different metrics, I have seen time and time again that there is a subset, in my estimates, probably a third of people, where when they have a really high saturated fat diet, even when it's from whole foods, nutrient-dense foods, we see those labs change in the wrong direction. We decrease it, we see it go in the right direction. There's very clear variable. But then I would say there's probably a majority of people where it doesn't seem to matter that much, as long as they're in a good, you know, energy balance, that's whole food, nutrient dense, et cetera. So that variability, I think, is just part of the reason that there's so much debate. But what we have to understand is that we're all different.
Yeah. I've become, I mean, talking to experts such as yourself, and my own personal experience and the experience that I have interacting with all my, you know, like readers and followers, I've become, and also other people with different viewpoints than me, right? Like I try to expose myself to as many viewpoints as possible, even if they don't necessarily mirror my own. And I've just become so much more moderate, you know, like I, you know, the beef that I'm eating these days is leaner. It's by no means lean. It's still freaking delicious. Like I eat a lot of fillets and tenderloins and flank steak and New York steaks, you know, but like, and I love a good ribeye, but I mean, I would be lying if at this point I said it's like healthy to eat a super fatty, industrially farmed ribeye every night, which many on social media will do, you know? So
yeah, my general framework that I try to teach people is first, master the basics. There are fundamentals that are, you know, good general advice for everyone. Nutrient density, you know, satiety, minimally processed, cook at home, don't eat out as much. So master those basics. And then second is be empirical. So track the right metrics, and not just labs and data, but also track how you feel subjectively. What are your energy levels? What does your skin look like? What does your hair look like? What is your weight? That's an important metric too. But again, it's only one number in all of the metrics that we want to look at. So look at those things, track trends over time, and then be malleable. So be willing to change based off of what you're seeing. And if you follow that kind of general framework, then I think most people are probably set up for success, where it's like, don't major in the minors, master those fundamentals, really get the basics down, and then pay attention to data, numbers, look at the trends, and then be more flexible than probably most people want to be at baseline as a human. Because as humans, again, black and white thinking, it's hard for us, but that will get you a long way.
It will. Among all the different diets proselytized by the different diet tribes, which in your estimation is the worst?
I would say the worst for the general American is probably like vegan. If I had to say it, I'm going to get the reason being, I think you could actually make vast majority of diets work because humans are so adaptable. But I think it requires a lot of work and effort and being super meticulous if you want to make a vegan diet doable. And I don't think most people are capable of doing that. So,
okay. Well, I'm on board. I just had the biggest grin for people that are just listening. I was grinning ear to ear. But just to play devil's advocate, if you optimize a vegan diet, we'll just say an optimal vegan diet.
Yeah.
Is an optimized vegan diet better than, say, an optimized omnivorous diet?
No.
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 Why not?
Because I think that while you can optimize a vegan diet, you can always make something better. It's still not the best form or source of protein to get from plant-based sources. So I think one of the best reasons for being pro-omnivorous is that protein to me is the most important macronutrient. That seems to be less debated in our space. Most people tend to agree, although not everybody. But protein is really important. And we know for glucose control as well that protein is one of the most beneficial ways to manage blood glucose levels, but also manage satiety and weight. And so by excluding some of the best forms of protein, most people are at a disadvantage. So what I see often is that in order to get those protein needs in a vegan diet, you're having to do a lot of protein powders, supplemental protein, because it's hard to get it through just things like tofu and beans that also come with, other macronutrients in them. And so I think protein is the biggest concern because protein powders, while they have a time and a place, and I think they're really helpful if you're just not able to get the protein naturally, is not the same as eating a whole food, nutrient-dense, quality source of protein.
Yeah.
And we also know that to optimize a vegan diet, you need to add supplements. Whereas an optimized omnivorous diet, there's maybe a role for supplements, but I don't think you need to in order to optimize it.
Right.
And we know this with research that a lot of times when you look at the benefit of a supplement or a nutrient in isolation, you can't replicate the same effects of when you're eating that in a food source where it's naturally found. This has been shown over and over again it's just not the same because there's probably synergistic effects happening when you eat the actual food that is dense in that nutrient. So eating something like, a grass-fed piece of meat, grass-fed steak is different than isolating some B vitamins and taking it separately. So really trying to get the nutrients from the food as much as possible, I think is a much more optimal route than supplementing.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Beautifully stated. Yeah, it's like playing a cat and mouse game with nutrients, and that just makes zero sense from the standpoint of biology.
Yep, exactly. Same, yeah, with nutrients, and then we do the same thing when thinking about conditions. We have a cardiologist who specializes in heart health, and then we have our endocrinologist who specializes in diabetes, and we assume that these systems don't interact or that our body as a system isn't, constantly speaking to each other and interacting with each other. So we have this fallacy in thinking of kind of separating things into their little individual parts and assuming that that's the whole picture. When really, with food, with our bodies, it's more complex and there's all this, synergistic effect and cross communication. that we're probably being overly simplistic when we try to reduce it to just a nutrient.
100%. That's why, I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, but people who, for example, are trying to lower their, let's just say ApoB, right? Maybe they'll go to their cardiologist, and the cardiologist will say, well, the best way to do that is to like cut out the animal fat. And so what they'll do is they think of red meat as being just animal fat, right? Red meat equals animal, but red meat is actually a great source of so many different nutrients, micronutrients, macronutrients like protein, and so you're removing this food. You're like I don't know, there's a good expression for it, and it's eluding me, but you're basically like, you're losing sight of the forest for the trees, essentially, and you're cutting out this macro, and that's like this food group, and that's like an experiment, like what's going to happen to your body composition 6 months from now, a year from now?
Yeah.
You could go for like leaner cuts, for example. I'm just using that as an example, but
and that's why you have to really look at the research diligently, or find someone you trust who is looking at the research diligently, because it requires a lot of work. I get why people don't do it. But like as a personal example, I have the ApoE44 genotype. And if you just kind of surface level start reading some blogs and articles and headlines, it's like, don't eat saturated fat, like eat low fat, like, monitor fat intake is kind of the big takeaway. But then when you start looking at the actual research, it's overly simplistic like that. They give people like supplemental fat sources and assume that that's the same as eating like a grass-fed steak or, eating quality nutrition. So when I dug into the research and looked at the actual methodology, I was like, I am not changing how I eat based off of this research, because it's just not compelling.
Wow.
Like, it's not compelling enough for me to completely alter my day-to-day. I care about the risk factors that come with that genotype. So again, I'm monitoring my lab values and kind of tweaking and fine-tuning. But I have found that I can still eat, moderately high-fat diet. I have a pretty high-fat saturated fat intake compared to like, the standard recommendations, and all my labs look good. So until I see those change, I'm not necessarily going to adjust that. But if you just read, kind of the first 3 blogs that come up when you look at the ApoE44 risk factors and recommendations, you'd probably be like, well, I should completely cut out all saturated fat. And you might end up as a vegan as a result of that.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. Okay, so let me add context. So you carry 2 copies of the ApoE4 allele. Incidentally, most recently, this was in the headlines because it was revealed that Chris Hemsworth carries both, the same. He's got the same genotype, putting him at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. And he was like, I'm retiring from acting. I'm going to really start focusing on my health. So when you discovered that you had both copies, which puts you at higher risk, right? What did you change in your diet and lifestyle?
Yeah, I did a deep dive. So when I first found out, I was actually really surprised. So this was a couple years ago, and I got like a free genetic test. I had no interest in testing because I did not think that I had any genetic SNPs of interest. Like I didn't think I had the ApoE4 because I have no family history of Alzheimer's.
Wow.
And that's, what you think of as Alzheimer's gene. And so then when I had 2 copies, I was very surprised. But the more you do the research, you realize not only is it increasing your risk of Alzheimer's, it's all neurodegenerative diseases that it increases your risk of, and cardiovascular disease. And looking at my family tree, I have multiple instances of Parkinson's in both sides of my family. My dad had ALS, which might be related, and every male on my mom's side has died from a cardiovascular event before the age of 60.
Wow.
So if you look at that, I was like, okay, that does make sense. But originally I was like, there's no dementia at all. So I'm assuming I didn't have it. So when I found out that I had this risk factor, I looked at all the literature. I kind of made a comprehensive plan for myself, and I really didn't actually end up changing very much in my day-to-day habits. But what I have done is just be much, much more meticulous about staying on top of tracking different things. So what I have really come to the conclusion is with all genetic risk factors, it loads the gun, but it's your lifestyle habits that pull the trigger. So I am more susceptible to certain outcomes, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. but that means I need to be more careful than maybe my counterpart who won the genetic lottery. People are always like, what about the 100-year-old who's smoking a pack a day and drinking a Coke every day? And it's like, well, they are genetically protected, you know, with some sort of set of genes where some of us are not. And so I just need to be more careful. And what I have realized is that I think it comes down to preventing any signs of insulin resistance, really being on top of anything that might drive chronic inflammation, and then really reducing toxin exposure as much as possible. So, you know, I work in the field of metabolic health, so I have already been kind of on top of that. So it didn't really change any of my day-to-day habits, except for really making sure that, you know, there's no signs of insulin resistance. With inflammation, you know, also kind of similarly already trying to eat a very nutrient-dense diet, trying to avoid any form of, you know, chronic inflammation, et cetera. Exercise, we know, is one of our most powerful tools, both for insulin resistance, metabolic health, and also for ApoE44 and, you know, brain health in general. So I've already, you know, always was exercising a lot, but just really understanding the importance of that in a robust workout routine and plan. So sticking to that. And then I think what I changed the most was being more mindful of kind of the toxin exposures. Because that's something when it's like when you're younger, you know, I found out about the ApoE4 in my early mid-20s. And so you're not really thinking about some of these other factors, but that pushed me to, you know, make sure that I'm caring about my water quality, my air quality, swapping out my beauty products for the more expensive beauty products that are less toxic. So it's that push that I might not have done before. But knowing that, you know, part of the mechanisms at play with the ApoE4 is kind of that blood-brain barrier is a little more loose is how I describe it. So you're more susceptible to some of those negative effects of toxin exposure. And you're also more susceptible to create this enhanced inflammatory response to anything coming in. So just being a lot more mindful of kind of those types of things, really paying attention to like air quality and the different toxins around you. And again, you can't avoid all toxins. If you try to do that, you're going to drive yourself absolutely insane. So that also means enhancing your natural detoxifying processes. So drinking lots of water, sweating a lot, so sauna, things like that, exercise, making sure that you're having regular bowel movements. So things like that where you're just helping enhance your body's natural detoxification as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important. Like people should these genetic risk factors, it's like if you carry this gene, what we know about the increased risk that these genes impose is really based on population level studies here in the United States. Like, so like your genotype with exposure to the standard American diet and lifestyle might increase your risk, what, like 14-fold compared to a non-carrier.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
but that's like
10 to 15x.
Right. But then you might move yourself to a less industrialized part of the world with less air pollution, with a less industrialized food supply and see that risk like abolished. So who's to say that you can't just like curate your environment here, you know, at home
exactly
to more closely mimic those environments where those genes seem to impose less risk.
And while it's scary, you know, when you see those genetic risk factors, I have left feeling optimistic and very confident that I'm in control of my health. And I think there's just the more you dig into it, like I'm saying, those surface level recommendations are like, avoid saturated fat, eat low fat. But if you dig into it deeper, it's really that connection to, you know, inflammation and metabolic health. And it seems to be that if you can keep those things under control, that your outcomes are pretty good. So I feel confident in my abilities. You know, I'm grateful for all the information that's out there, but it is really challenging for the average person to probably look through that information with such a fine lens. And so that's, you know, part of kind of what got me interested in this space as well, is really, you know, helping people understand there's more to metabolic health than just diabetes, which is an extremely detrimental condition as well. But there is that connection to brain health and to other chronic illnesses, and, you know, some of these genetic predispositions are going to increase your risk as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, we know that you're closely monitoring your metabolic health with the NutriSense CGM, but like in broad strokes, describe your dietary pattern for us. Cause you mentioned, you know, omnivore, you eat a fair amount of saturated fat, but yeah, kind of like in broad strokes, paint that picture more, I guess, more clearly for us.
Yeah. And what I will say is it's always changing. So what I'm eating today, you know, may change, but from broad sense, I would say it's still considered lowish carb. I tend to eat somewhere between like 100 and 150 grams of carbs in a day.
I think that's like around where I'm at.
Yeah. And I'm really active, so that works well for me. To maintain my weight, I tend to need about like 2,200 calories. So for my size, that's like a decent amount. And I try to aim for about like 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight. So I'm really prioritizing protein. I'm including some carbohydrates, but I do it based off of my circumstance. So again, if I like missed my workout or something, I'm probably more like 50 grams of carbohydrates in that day. And then I do prioritize a lot of non-starchy vegetables. So a variety of colorful vegetables. I think that fiber is another thing that's hotly debated in this space, but I think for most people, fiber is a good thing and it is helpful for them. So, you know, I eat a lot of prioritized protein, non-starchy vegetables, eat some carbohydrates, and then I try to have 2 or 3 large meals in the day and really just like minimize snacking. And again, a lot of these are methods to help avoid overeating. Like, you know, the fasting camp wants to ignore calories, but it's a approach, a strategy to help avoid overeating. And I have found that if I do the 2 to 3 larger meals, I have more stable energy levels and I don't end up like kind of like overeating, falling in that grazing type of habits, which is one of the things I really try to get everyone to avoid doing.
You have to restrict yourself in some capacity today. You just have to.
Yeah, you have to.
You have to. You just have to find the method of restriction that feels the least restrictive to you.
Yeah, that works for you. And again, it has to be sustainable because the consistency thing is the thing that matters. So you got to find the approach that works for you. And for me, you know, I eat a really big breakfast. I always have eggs and I always have some extra protein in it from whatever I cooked the night before and a bunch of vegetables, kimchi. I like a lot of like fermented foods in my diet as well. I think that's super helpful for gut health and has that ripple effect into all different aspects of health. And then, you know, a big piece of protein, usually in a salad or with some vegetables for dinner. And then I might have another snack, just snack as in like my third meal. It tends to be smaller if I do have a third meal. If I'm just based on my routine. And
when it comes to starchier forms of carbohydrates, like what are your go-tos?
Yeah, so my go-tos are berries. So fruit in general, but berries and kind of some of the more like tart apples are my go-to fruits.
What's your favorite apple?
My favorite apple is Pink Lady.
Pink Lady. Interesting.
What about you?
Those are good. I'm Honeycrisp guy through and through. Love those. Cosmic Crisp, pretty good. But give me a good Honeycrisp any day.
Yeah, they're good.
Yeah.
So I do some fruit. I do a decent amount of like potatoes. I prefer white potatoes. Actually, I know like sweet potatoes is like the hot. Everybody thinks sweet potatoes, but I prefer white potatoes. So that's what I eat. And actually I have a lower glucose response to white potatoes than sweet potatoes.
Interesting.
Which is just one of those like bio-individuality things.
Yeah.
I don't do a lot of grains, but I will do some steel-cut oats sometimes as well, primarily because they're super satiating. So especially if I'm like trying to reduce like 1 or 2 pounds of weight, that tends to be something that I include.
Yeah.
So savory oats, I don't know if you've ever gone that route, can be pretty tasty.
Yeah, no, I eat a very low grain diet, but I've always copped to the fact that I will eat rice with my sushi because I freaking love sushi.
Yeah.
And sushi rice is cooked and cooled, so you get a little bit of that like resistant starch. But yeah, I like, you know, I'm 40 years old and I just basically discovered oats, and they're good. I mean, they're
good.
They're satiating. Okay, so I don't know how this works from a chemical standpoint, but if you I discovered overnight oats, and I buy like gluten-free. I look for glyphosate-free, or I buy organic. So, you know, I mean, I know that oats have their issues. But I try to be pretty like diligent about like, you know, what I'm buying, or discerning rather. And if you make overnight oats and you mix casein protein into it, I found this like casein. I've been using casein, which is like a slower digesting protein. Something happens to the chemistry of the oats and the casein. It becomes like icing. It becomes like this, it takes on this like insane texture. And I found, I'm like a 12-year-old. I'm getting like really indulgent now, but I found on Amazon recently these like keto sprinkles, like ice cream sprinkles. Yeah. So they're like sprinkles, right? That you put on like ice cream, but they're sugar-free.
Yeah.
All natural colors. So I basically mix, this is like how I've been starting my mornings before I go like to the gym, with this like overnight oats with sprinkle a little bit of salt. And then I mix in this vanilla casein protein, and you mix it up. It becomes like, I swear to God, it becomes like ice cream. It's amazing. And then I put these like sprinkles on it. And I'm having like birthday cake in the morning. And it's so
You can see the joy on your face.
Yeah. You don't even know. I'm like the happiest 12-year-old in the world, like when I'm eating this stuff. And then I go to the gym and I have like the best workout ever. Like, what's not to like?
Yeah. And that matters.
Yeah.
Like those factors matter. And that's where I tell people to also be really mindful about what you're eating too. There's so many times where people will eat something that's maybe not aligned with what they believe is optimal for them. So maybe an actual piece of cake or, an actual donut or whatever that's representing. And they're not even really enjoying it, or it's super mindless and it's like was totally not worth it. But then there are some things that bring you so much joy, like maybe it's sushi, or maybe it's your breakfast concoction of whatever way you make it.
Sushi brings me so much joy.
Yeah, and those are intentional trade-offs.
Yeah.
Like it's like, I know maybe this isn't the thing I should do every single day, but I love this and it tastes amazing and it brings me joy. And that can be part of your routine too.
Yeah.
We don't have to be black and white and completely omit things that maybe aren't part of the plan, but you should omit the things that aren't worth it. And that's where I think a lot of people are maybe too lenient, where it's like everything fits or everything in moderation. It's like, if it's not bringing you that much joy and it's also not bringing you health, then don't even bother doing it. That's where it's like, try to make those trade-offs and be a little bit of mindful intention with your food choices.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you're indulging, like make sure that you really love it. Like don't just be indulging to be putting something in your mouth, or like,
like you're at a party and there's like crappy hors d'oeuvres and you're just kind of snacking on them. You're like, these don't even taste good, but they're like fried and gross and packaged. It's like, just don't do it. Yeah. And enjoy that thing you really love instead.
Just a waste. Don't waste your calories.
Yeah.
Any calorie you eat is basically another calorie that you're not sucking out of your own fat tissue.
Exactly.
Right? So it's like, make sure that you're enjoying what it is that you're eating at the very least.
Yeah,
absolutely. This was super fun. I'm going to try one of these. I've worn a CGM in the past, but I'm excited to use your app. And stick this thing on my arm.
Yeah, you'll have to let us know if you learn anything interesting.
Yeah.
I feel like every time I put one on, I learn something new.
Really?
Which is fun. But there is like, in general, I always explain there's like a knowledge gaining stage where it's like you're learning how you respond, you're learning what your glucose levels look like, you're trying different things, you're altering your routine. And then for most people, eventually we switch from knowledge gaining to kind of like accountability, behavior change stage. So for many people, eventually it's kind of, they keep it on to keep them accountable, keep those habits consistent and sticky.
No, it's awesome. And you look cool wearing them. They're like conversation starters. And yeah, I'm pumped. I'm pumped for it. When did you start NutriSense?
2019.
Wow.
Yeah. So early 2019.
And you're like, I mean, you look pretty, I'm not going to guess your age, but like you're pretty young. You've done quite a bit in your...
I like to dream big. So that's the only way to live, right?
Yeah. I mean, amazing. It's awesome. It's awesome. Well, you've got a great head on your shoulders. And this was, again, super informative. I'm sure my listeners derived a lot of value from this. And I'm excited to try a CGM because I haven't worn one in a while. So I'm going to pop this thing on.
Awesome.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.